The air in the Somerset marshes in the year 8 Century was thick, heavy with the smell of damp earth, peat smoke, and an almost tangible despair. Here, in the labyrinth of boggy islands and reed beds of Athelney, the last king of a free England was hiding. Alfred, ruler of Wessex, descendant of Cerdic, was not a formidable monarch in shining armor, but a haggard fugitive, his kingdom shrunk to the size of a muddy camp. His face, usually thoughtful and pale from chronic illness, had grown gaunt, and the bitterness of defeat was frozen in his eyes. This was rock bottom, the nadir of his fate, the point where history could have ended. Legend, passed down through the centuries, tells of how the king, taking refuge in a peasant woman's hut, was left to watch cakes on the hearth. Lost in dark thoughts about his shattered world, he let them burn, earning a furious scolding from the woman, who had no idea who he was. This anecdote, perhaps fictional, brilliantly captures the depth of his fall. A ruler who had lost a kingdom could not even keep watch over a piece of bread. It was in this humiliation, in the silence of the marshes, broken only by the cries of birds and the whispers of his loyal thans, that the incredible plan that would change everything was born. Here, on the ruins of his world, the frail scholar began to transform into the architect of victory. The question that echoed through the mists of Athelney was not simply how to survive, but how to raise a flame from these ashes. And to understand the answer, one must first understand the nature of the firestorm that had burned his world to the ground, the apocalyptic invasion of the Northmen. To fully grasp the scale of Alfred's genius, one must first plunge into the bloody chaos that was 9th century England. It was not a single, unified nation, but a patchwork of warring kingdoms known to historians as the Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy. Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Sussex, Kent, and Wessex. These lands were linked by a common language and faith, but divided by decades of petty wars, dynastic intrigues, and deep mistrust. They were like a handful of quarrelsome brothers, unable to unite even in the face of a mortal threat. And that threat came from the sea. Since the end of the 8th century, Scandinavian raiders, the Vikings, had terrorized the coasts. But in the middle of the 9th century, their tactics changed. These were no longer mere raids for gold and slaves. In the year 865, what the chronicles call the Great Heathen Army landed on the shores of East Anglia, led by the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. This was no longer a band of raiders, but a nation on the move, an invasion force hungry not just for plunder, but for land and vengeance. For the Anglo-Saxons, it was a cultural and religious shock. The Vikings were ruthless, their tactics lightning fast, their fury on the battlefield boundless. They were the embodiment of pagan terror for the Christian world, destroyers of monasteries, murderers of priests, a living nightmare from the pages of the apocalypse. One by one, the ancient kingdoms fell. Northumbria was conquered, its kings executed. East Anglia was crushed, its ruler, Edmund, tortured and killed. The mighty kingdom of Mercia, the eternal rival of Wessex, was brought to its knees and turned into a puppet state. By the year 870, of all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, only Wessex remained independent, the last bastion of Christian England, a thin wall separating civilization from being completely swallowed by a wave of northern paganism. And it was against this wall that the full, unstoppable might of the great army now crashed. Alfred was born in 849 at the royal estate of Wantage, in a world already coming apart at the seams. He was the youngest, the 5th son of King Ethelwulf of Wessex. In the brutal world of Anglo-Saxon politics, this meant his chances of inheriting the throne were almost zero. The crown was destined for his older brothers, Ethelbald, Ethelbert, and Ethelred. Alfred was a different kind of child, frail, sickly, but with a burning, insatiable curiosity. While his brothers practiced with the sword and spear, he was drawn to books, to tales of ancient kings and saints, to the wisdom locked away in Latin manuscripts. His father, a deeply religious man, saw this quality and perhaps intended a spiritual career for him. A fateful event in his early life was a pilgrimage to Rome. At the age of just 4 or 5, he traveled with his father to the Eternal City, the heart of the Christian world. This experience left an indelible mark on his soul. He saw the grandeur of the Roman Empire's ruins, the organized power of the papal court, and felt the breath of 1,000 years of history and culture. As the chronicles attest, Pope Leo IV not only received the young prince, but also anointed him as king. This symbolic act, devoid of political weight at the time, would later be interpreted as a divine omen. Returning to Wessex, Alfred looked upon the wooden halls and muddy roads of his homeland with new eyes. He saw not just a kingdom to be defended, but an outpost of civilization that could and should be developed. The legacy of his dynasty, the House of Cerdic, was one of warriors, but in Alfred, this legacy was mixed with something new, an understanding that a kingdom's true strength lay not only in the sharpness of its swords, but in the wisdom of its laws, the power of its faith, and the light of its learning. This duality, this internal conflict between the warrior and the scholar, would become the defining feature of his personality and his reign. There is a story, almost a myth, that reveals the essence of young Alfred's character better than any historical chronicle and foretells his unique path. It is said that one day, his mother, Queen Osber, showed her sons a beautifully illustrated book of Saxon poems, a treasure in a world where parchment was more precious than weapons. She promised the book to whichever of them could first learn to read it. His older brothers, already young warriors, likely saw it as just a pretty trinket, a collection of meaningless symbols. But Alfred, the youngest, was captivated. He saw in its pages not just pictures, but a whole world, a gateway to the wisdom and stories of his ancestors. Driven by this sudden desire, he found a tutor and, as the legend goes, learned to read in the shortest possible time, after which he returned to his mother and claimed his promised reward. This story is a perfect metaphor for his philosophy on life. Where others saw only brute force and the glory of battle as the sole path to power, Alfred instinctively sensed the power of knowledge. For him, literacy was not just a skill, but a weapon, a tool for understanding the world, learning from the mistakes of the past, and building the future. While his brothers prepared to rule by the sword, Alfred was learning to rule by the mind. This episode highlights the fundamental paradox of his nature. In a society that valued physical prowess above all else, he chose the path of intellectual development. This was not an escape from reality. On the contrary, it was an immersion into a deeper reality, the reality of ideas, laws, and divine order. The Book of Poems became his first conquered trophy, his first victory won not by the strength of his muscles, but by the force of his will and intellect. And this prophecy in verse came true. It was Alfred's ability to read the world, to analyze situations, develop complex strategies, and see long-term prospects that became the key that allowed him to defeat enemies his stronger, more warlike brothers could not. Behind the exterior of the thoughtful scholar and pious prince lay a dark reality that shaped his character with no less force than books and prayers. From his early years until the end of his life, Alfred suffered from a severe chronic illness. Medieval sources, particularly his biographer Acer, describe it as sudden and agonizing attacks of pain that could incapacitate him for days or weeks. Modern medical experts, analyzing these descriptions, suggest it may have been Crohn's disease or another form of inflammatory bowel disease. In an age when medicine was powerless, this illness was a constant physical and spiritual trial. Imagine a commander who at any moment could be struck down not by an enemy spear, but by his own body. Imagine a king needing to make fateful decisions while fighting bouts of agony that contemporaries might have seen as a sign of divine displeasure. This constant battle with pain became a harsh but effective forge for Alfred's character. First, it taught him humility. He could not rely on his physical strength like other leaders, which forced him to seek support elsewhere, in his intellect, his faith, and the people around him. Second, it forged in him an incredible inner discipline and resilience. A person accustomed to living with constant pain develops an iron will, the ability to endure and to act when others would have given up. His victories on the battlefield were merely the outward expression of his main, daily victory over his own suffering. Third, his ailment likely deepened his piety. In his suffering, he could see a reflection of the suffering of Christ and the holy martyrs, which strengthened his faith and gave him a sense of higher purpose. He was not just fighting for his kingdom, he was waging a holy war, and his personal pain was but a small part of this great drama. Thus, what appeared to be his greatest weakness became the source of his hidden strength. The illness robbed him of a warrior's health, but in its place, it gave him the psychological endurance, strategic foresight, and unshakable faith that proved to be far more formidable weapons in the fight against the Vikings than the strongest muscles or the sharpest axe. In the year 871, Wessex was drowning in blood. This year went down in history as the year of 9 great battles. The great heathen army, having crushed the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, fell upon the last bastion of resistance with its full might. The king at that time was Alfred's older brother, Ethelred, and the 22-year-old Alfred held the title of Secundarius, the recognized heir and second in command. It was in this fiery baptism that the paradoxical genius of the future king first fully emerged. The climax came at the Battle of Ashdown. The army of Wessex took up a position on a high ridge, while the Vikings, dividing their forces into 2 columns, under 2 kings and several jarls, prepared to attack. The Anglo-Saxons also split their forces. One part was commanded by King Ethelred, the other by Prince Alfred. And at this critical moment, as the Danish warriors began their advance, something strange happened. King Ethelred, a deeply devout man, refused to enter the battle until the mass he was hearing in his tent was over. He declared that he would not abandon the service of God for the service of men. For the army, this was tantamount to disaster. Delay threatened a complete rout, and so Alfred, the scholar, the sickly youth, faced the first great choice of his life: to obey the will of his king and brother and doom the army, or to take responsibility and defy the order. He chose the latter. As his biographer Asser writes, like a wild boar, Alfred led his troops in a desperate charge up the slope, straight into the dense ranks of the Vikings. He took the brunt of the assault, buying his brother time to finish his prayers. When Ethelred finally joined the battle, its outcome had already been decided by the audacity and resolve of his younger brother. The Battle of Ashdown was a great victory for the Anglo-Saxons, in which one of the Danish kings and many of their jarls were killed. It was a moment of truth. Alfred proved that his love of books did not make him a coward, and his piety did not prevent him from acting decisively and pragmatically. He showed that he could think like a commander and risk everything for victory. This was the first blood, the first bright glimpse of the future great king, who was still hidden in his brother's shadow. Behind the desperate bravery on the battlefield and the quiet hours spent over manuscripts lay a deep, all-consuming motivation that drove Alfred throughout his entire life. It was not simply a desire to survive or to preserve the throne of his ancestors. For Alfred, the struggle against the Vikings was something much greater. It was a battle for the very soul of civilization. He had witnessed the fiery wave of paganism sweep across England, wiping from the face of the earth what he valued most. The monasteries that were centers of knowledge and culture, the libraries with their priceless manuscripts, the schools where the light of Latin learning still flickered. The Vikings were not just conquerors. In his eyes, they were agents of entropy, a force dragging the world back into the darkness of ignorance and barbarism. He saw how literacy levels were falling everywhere, how even priests could no longer understand Latin, how art and crafts were falling into decay. For him, this was a personal tragedy. His inner demon, his secret and primary ambition, was not just to repel the military threat, but to bring about a cultural and spiritual rebirth. He dreamed of a kingdom built on 3 pillars, as he would later write: men of prayer, men of war, and men of work. But shining over all of this should be the light of knowledge and divine law. He was not fighting for a territory called Wessex, but for an idea called Christendom. This transformed his struggle from a dynastic war into a sacred mission, a crusade before the age of crusades. It was this deep, almost fanatical conviction in his own righteousness that gave him the strength to endure physical pain, the humiliation of defeat, and the bitterness of betrayal. He was certain that he was acting as an instrument in the hands of God, destined to save his people from oblivion. This inner conviction also explains his later, seemingly illogical actions, his mercy towards the defeated Guthrum, his obsession with educational reforms, his titanic efforts to translate books. He was fighting a war on 2 fronts. On the battlefield, he fought for the bodies of his subjects, but at his desk, he fought for their souls and their future. And for him, the second battle was perhaps even more important than the first. Ascending to the throne in 871 after the death of his brother Ethelred, who died from wounds sustained in battle, the 22-year-old Alfred found himself in a desperate situation. He became king not in a moment of triumph, but in his kingdom's hour of agony. Wessex was bled dry. The year of 9 battles had exhausted the army, emptied the treasury, and sown fear and despair in the hearts of the people. The great heathen army, despite its tactical defeat at Ashdown, hadn't gone away. It regrouped and continued to ravage his lands. In the very first month of his reign, Alfred had to endure another battle, which he lost. He understood the harsh truth. Wessex could fight no more. Any new battle would be its last. And so the young king, who many likely considered hot-headed and inexperienced, made a decision that shocked his contemporaries and was seen as an act of cowardice and humiliation. He chose to buy peace. As the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reports, Alfred made an agreement with the Vikings and paid them a tribute to leave Wessex. In the eyes of proud thegns and warriors, this looked like a shameful surrender. To pay an enemy you had just been defeating in battle. What could be more humiliating? But behind this outward show of weakness lay a cold and brilliant strategic calculation. Alfred, the scholar, understood what his warriors did not. He didn't need a battle. He needed time. Time to bury the dead, gather the harvest, refill the treasury, rebuild the army, and most importantly, rethink the entire strategy of the war. He used gold not as tribute, but as a weapon, buying the most precious resource he lacked. This shameful peace was in fact a masterful move, a tactical breathing space that allowed him to save his kingdom from certain collapse. He swallowed his pride to win the future. This episode was the first manifestation of his unique style of rule, pragmatism, based on deep analysis, and a willingness to make unorthodox decisions that might look like weakness, but were in fact acts of the greatest strategic wisdom. The next 5 years, from 872 to 887, were a period of deceptive calm for Wessex. The great Viking army moved north to finally conquer Mercia and divide the lands among themselves, creating what would later become known as the Danelaw, or the area of Danish law. For many in Wessex, this may have seemed like the end of the war, a chance to return to a peaceful life. But Alfred harbored no illusions. He knew the Vikings would be back. This respite was not a time of rest for him, but the most intense period of preparation for the inevitable storm. He understood that the old ways of war no longer worked. The Anglo-Saxon levy, the fyrd, which was called up for short periods, was incapable of standing against the professional, mobile, and permanent army of the Vikings. To fight them in open battle was suicide. A new system was needed, a total reform that would affect every aspect of the kingdom. And so, Alfred began his quiet revolution. In the seclusion of his court, surrounded by a few loyal advisors, he developed a plan that would transform Wessex from a victim into an impregnable fortress. He studied Roman military treatises and analyzed the enemy's tactics, their strengths and weaknesses. He realized that the Vikings' main advantages were speed, mobility, and the ability to strike anywhere, anytime. Therefore, to defeat them, he had to strip them of these advantages. His plan was comprehensive, consisting of 3 main parts that he began to slowly and methodically implement: military reform, the creation of a defensive network, and the building of a navy. It was a titanic undertaking, requiring enormous resources and political will. Many of his thanes likely grumbled, not understanding the need for such expense and effort in a time of peace. But Alfred was adamant. He was not just building an army. He was building a machine of total defense, a carefully designed mechanism that had to work at the decisive moment. These were the years of gathering strength, when the scholar on the throne was transforming into a grand strategist, preparing for the most important contest of his life. The first and perhaps most crucial element of Alfred's revolution was the radical reform of the Anglo-Saxon army. The traditional fyrd was, in essence, a peasant levy. All free landowners were obliged to serve when summoned by the king, but this service was limited, usually to 40 or 60 days. This was sufficient for short campaigns against neighbors, but completely inadequate for a protracted war with the Vikings. As soon as their term of service ended, the men went home to get the harvest in, leaving the kingdom defenseless. Alfred understood this fatal weakness. His ingenious solution was both simple and revolutionary. He divided the fyrd into 2 halves. While one half of the levy was on active duty in garrisons or in the field army, the other half tended to their farms. Then they would rotate. This simple administrative change had colossal consequences. First, it effectively created the first standing professional army in England since the Romans, one that could be kept in a state of readiness all year round. Now Alfred could plan long campaigns, besiege fortresses, and keep constant pressure on the enemy, without fearing that his army would melt away at the most critical moment. Second, this prevented the kingdom's economy from being undermined. The peasants could both fight and work the land, providing the army with food. The system became self-sufficient. Third, he reorganized the army itself, creating an elite corps of royal thanes, professional warriors who formed the backbone of the field forces, while the bulk of the levy performed garrison duty. This was not just a military breakthrough, but an intellectual one. Alfred applied his administrative and organizational talents to solve a purely military problem. He did not try to surpass the Vikings in fury or individual skill. He countered their chaotic force with an organized system. This was one of the key answers to the question of how a scholar could defeat warriors. He stopped playing by their rules and created his own, forcing the enemy into a war of attrition for which they were completely unprepared. The second pillar of Alfred's defensive strategy, inextricably linked with his military reform, was the creation of an unprecedented network of fortified sites known as burhs. Alfred realized it was impossible to protect every town and village from the lightning raids of the Vikings. Instead, he decided to create a stone necklace around his kingdom, a chain of 33 strategically located fortresses. Some were built from scratch, others were restored and strengthened Roman forts or Iron Age hill forts. Their placement was brilliant. No inhabitant of Wessex was more than 20 miles, roughly a day's journey, from the nearest boor. This meant that in the event of a Viking attack, the local population could quickly take refuge behind strong walls, saving their lives and property. This deprived the Vikings of their main objective, easy plunder and provisions. But the burhs were not just passive shelters. Each had a permanent garrison, drawn from the local levy, and served as a base for the mobile units of Alfred's reformed army. If the Vikings besieged one burh, garrisons from neighboring fortresses could strike them from the rear. If they passed by, their supply lines were threatened. Thus, the entire territory of Wessex was turned into a single, deep, layered defensive system, a deadly trap for the enemy. The creation of this network was a colossal engineering and administrative achievement. A special document, the Burgle Hittage, was compiled, detailing how many men were required to defend each boor and which lands were obliged to supply these men and resources. It was a complex logistical and fiscal system that required meticulous planning and accounting, a task that only a ruler with the mind of a scholar could manage. The burhs changed the very nature of the war. They forced the Vikings, who were accustomed to mobile warfare, to get bogged down in long and fruitless sieges, giving Alfred time to assemble his main army and deliver a decisive blow. It was a strategy of attrition, a strategy of intellect against a strategy of brute force. To understand the essence of this conflict, it is not enough to speak only of armies and fortresses. We must look into the eyes of Alfred's primary antagonist. This was Guthrum, one of the leaders of the great heathen army. To imagine him as a mere savage would be a dangerous mistake. Guthrum was a product of his time, a cunning, ruthless, and extremely ambitious commander. He was not like the raiding chieftains of the past. He was one of the first Viking kings who sought not just plunder, but conquest, the creation of his own kingdom on the fertile lands of England. He was a master of surprise attacks and treacherous maneuvers, as he demonstrated when he captured Wareham and Exeter through trickery and broken oaths. His main weapon was psychological warfare. He inspired terror, was unpredictable, and was always one step ahead of his opponents. For him, war was a natural state, and peace was merely a temporary respite to prepare for the next strike. The clash between Alfred and Guthrum was not just a battle of two armies, it was a duel between two worldviews. Guthrum embodied pagan fatalism, the cult of strength and personal glory, a world where disputes are settled by the axe. Alfred, on the other hand, represented Christian order, a belief in divine law, in the power of organization and long-term planning. Guthrum was a master of tactics, a genius of the single battle. Alfred, by contrast, was a master of strategy, a thinker who saw the entire war as a single contest. Guthrum relied on the fury and charge of his warriors. Alfred relied on the discipline, logistics, and strength of his fortresses. Their confrontation reached its peak in the year 878. Guthrum seemed to be on the verge of final victory. He was confident in his superiority, certain that the last Anglo-Saxon king was broken, and hiding in the marshes like a hunted animal. He could not imagine that at that very moment, his Scholar King opponent, analyzing all his past defeats, was creating an entirely new formula for victory that would turn their world upside down. The catastrophe that brought Alfred to the lowest point of his fate struck at the most unexpected and sacred time for Christians. In early January of 1878, during the celebration of Christmas, when all of Wessex was at ease, relying on a winter truce and oaths sworn by the Vikings, Guthrum launched his most treacherous attack. He did what was considered unthinkable, even by the brutal laws of the time: a surprise winter campaign. His army, like a phantom, crossed the border and marched swiftly on the royal residence at Chippenham. Alfred and his court were taken completely by surprise. This was not just a military operation, but an act of total betrayal, a demonstration that for the Vikings, there were no sacred dates and no sworn promises. They played by their own rules, which made them an even more terrifying enemy. Alfred barely managed to escape. With a small handful of loyal thanes, he was forced to hide in the forests and marshes of Somerset, while the main part of Wessex was occupied and plundered. The fall of Chippenham was a psychological blow of colossal force. It showed that nothing could stop the great army. The king was a fugitive, the nobility either killed or sworn to the invaders, and the people were demoralized. It seemed that the history of Wessex, and with it the history of an independent England, had come to its ignominious end. It was this event that brought us to the scene that began our story: the exiled king in the swamps of Athelney. Guthrum was sure he had dealt a mortal blow. He had scattered the enemy army, captured its capital, and put its king to flight. From a military standpoint, the war was won. But Guthrum, a tactical genius, had overlooked one thing. He had not broken Alfred's spirit. On the contrary, this ultimate humiliation, this treacherous betrayal, ignited a cold fury and an unbreakable resolve in the soul of the Scholar King. In the marshes of Athelney, he ceased to be merely a defender. He became an avenger, a warrior of God, preparing to strike back. From his refuge at Athelney, in the heart of the impenetrable marshes, Alfred did not fall into despair. This place, the symbol of his downfall, became the laboratory for his future victory. He used the very nature of the landscape as his primary weapon. The marshes, an insurmountable obstacle for a large Viking army, became the perfect base for Alfred's small, mobile units. From here, from his hidden fortress, he began to wage a new kind of war: guerrilla warfare. Together with his loyal Somerset thanes, he launched daring raids, attacking small Viking patrols, intercepting foragers, and disrupting their supply lines. It was a war of attrition, a war of bites and pinpricks that gave the occupiers no rest. Every trip for provisions became a deadly venture for them. Alfred acted not as a king leading regiments into battle, but as a cunning rebel leader. He gathered intelligence, studied the enemy's movements, and used his knowledge of the terrain to strike where he was least expected and vanish instantly back into the swamp. This period was critical for reviving the fighting spirit of the Anglo-Saxons. News that the king was alive and still fighting spread throughout Wessex, inspiring hope in the people. The small victories of his bands grew into legends, keeping the fire of resistance alive. At the same time, these guerrilla tactics wore down and demoralized the Vikings. They controlled the towns, but they could not control the countryside. They sat in their conquered kingdom like a besieged fortress, constantly feeling the unseen presence of the enemy. It was in these marshes that Alfred finally honed his style of warfare, based not on brute force, but on intelligence, cunning, and asymmetrical responses. He understood that to defeat a powerful enemy, you must first turn their strengths into weaknesses. The Vikings' mobility became their vulnerability when they had to defend extended lines of communication, and their large numbers became a curse when a huge army had to be fed in a hostile and constantly attacking territory. In the spring of 878, after several months of exhausting guerrilla warfare, Alfred sensed that the moment had come. His scouts reported that the Vikings were demoralized, their forces overstretched, and pockets of resistance were flaring up in different parts of the kingdom. It was time to turn 1,000 scattered sparks into a single, all-consuming flame. Alfred sent secret messengers to all the ealdormen and thegns of Wessex, Devon, and western Somerset, who remained loyal to him. He appointed a time and place for them to gather, at a large stone known as Egbert's Stone, on the border of 3 shires. The choice was deeply symbolic. Egbert was Alfred's great-grandfather, the first king of the Wessex dynasty to unite most of England under his rule. By summoning the army to his stone, Alfred was invoking the memory of his ancestors, a sense of unity and a common destiny. This was a call not just to his vassals, but to the entire nation. The chronicles describe this moment with unconcealed excitement. On the appointed day, from all directions, furred detachments began to stream towards the stone. The men, who for months had believed their king was dead and their cause lost, saw him alive, full of determination, and leading a battle-hardened warband. And they were glad to see him, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reports, concisely but powerfully. It was a scene of incredible emotional uplift, the joy of reuniting with their king mixed with a thirst for revenge and a resolve to win back their lands. In 2 days, Alfred assembled a huge army for the time. This was a triumph of his secret work. His reputation, his guerrilla successes, and his authority had proven strong enough to raise a whole kingdom to fight. The moment at Egbert's Stone became the turning point of the entire war. It was the shift from defense to offense, from survival to reconquest. The exiled king, emerging from the marshes, once again stood at the head of his people, and this united force, driven by desperation and hope, now marched to meet the enemy for the final battle. Having assembled his army, Alfred did not delay. He knew his only chance lay in speed and surprise. He led his forces towards Guthrum's main base, which was likely in the vicinity of the modern town of Edington, known in older sources as Heathen. It was here, on the rolling downs, that one of the most fateful battles in English history was fought. Alfred, knowing that his levied troops were inferior to the hardened Viking warriors in one-on-one combat, chose the only viable tactic, a defensive one. He formed his army into a dense shield wall, the traditional Anglo-Saxon formation, where warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, presenting a wall of round shields and a forest of spears. It was a living fortress, capable of withstanding the most ferocious assault. The battle, as sources describe, was brutal and long. The Vikings, true to their tactics, crashed against the Anglo-Saxon line with frenzied rage. A deafening roar erupted, the sound of thousands of axes and swords striking wooden shields, the shouts of the attackers, and the defiant cries of the defenders. Hour after hour, the Danes threw themselves, wave after wave, against the shield wall, trying to break through, to find a weak point. But Alfred's men, inspired by the presence of their king and fighting for their homes and families, stood to the death. Here, all the months of preparation, all the discipline Alfred had tried to instill in his army, paid off. They did not break, and they did not run. Alfred was in the front ranks, fighting alongside his men, setting an example of courage and fortitude. And at some point, the Vikings' fury began to wane. They were exhausted by their fruitless attacks, their fighting spirit broken by the sight of the impenetrable shield wall. Sensing this turning point, Alfred gave the order for a general counterattack. The weary but inspired Anglo-Saxons drove the Vikings from the hill and sent them into a panicked retreat. This was not just a victory, it was a total rout. Alfred pursued the remnants of Guthrum's army to their nearest fortress and laid siege to it. The Battle of Edington was a triumph, not of brute force, but of strategy, discipline, and indomitable will. The scholar on the battlefield had proven that he was the equal of the greatest warriors of his age. After a 2-week siege, the exhausted and starving Vikings, led by Guthrum, surrendered at Alfred's mercy. By the laws of war, Alfred had every right to execute every last one of them. This is what his warriors, thirsty for revenge for their burned homes and murdered families, expected of him. The execution of Guthrum, the treacherous oath-breaker, would have been a logical and just end to the war. But at this moment, Alfred made the most unorthodox and brilliant decision of his life. Instead of spilling blood, he offered peace and forgiveness. He demanded from Guthrum not only hostages and an oath to leave Wessex, but something far more important. He demanded that Guthrum and his chief warriors accept Christianity, and Alfred himself offered to be his sworn enemy's godfather. This was a move that broke every convention. For the Vikings, it was humiliating, but it was their only chance to live. For the Anglo-Saxons, it was incomprehensible and perhaps even insulting. But Alfred was looking far beyond a simple act of vengeance. He understood that it was impossible to destroy all the Vikings in England, but it might be possible to assimilate them, to turn them from mortal enemies into neighbors, bound by the ties of a common faith. The baptism of Guthrum, who was given the Christian name Ethelstan, was not just a religious ceremony. It was a political act of colossal significance. By becoming Guthrum's godfather, Alfred symbolically became his spiritual lord, and Guthrum, in turn, acknowledged his superiority. This Treaty of Wedmore, as it was later called, was the pinnacle of Alfred's diplomatic skill. He ended the war not just with a victory, but with the establishment of a new order. He showed that his greatest weapon was not just the sword, but wisdom, foresight, and an understanding of human psychology. This unthinkable act of mercy, shown at the height of his triumph, ultimately proved more effective than the most brutal slaughter. It laid the foundation for the future coexistence of Anglo-Saxons and Danes, and became the first step toward the unification of all of England. The Treaty of Wedmore and the baptism of Guthrum led to the formal division of England. Guthrum and his army withdrew to East Anglia, and a border was established along the rivers Thames and Lea, and then along the old Roman road of Watling Street. The territories to the north and east of this line became known as the Danelaw, an area where the veterans of the Great Army settled, and where Scandinavian laws and customs prevailed. At first glance, this might seem like a concession on Alfred's part, an admission that he was unable to reconquer the entire country. But paradoxically, it was this very division that laid the foundation for a unified England. Before the Viking invasion, the idea of England as a single political entity barely existed. There were the warring kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex. The Vikings, without intending to, acted as a terrible catalyst for unification. They destroyed all the Anglo-Saxon royal dynasties, except for one, the dynasty of Wessex. As a result, Alfred was left as the only legitimate Anglo-Saxon king, a symbol of resistance and hope for all English people living under Danish rule. By dividing the country, Alfred gained direct control over all Anglo-Saxon territories not conquered by the Vikings, including western Mercia. He became the ruler not just of Wessex, but of all free English people. It was during this period that he first began to use the title King of the Anglo-Saxons. This was a revolutionary step, asserting his claim to rule over the entire nation, not just one tribe. The Danelaw, in turn, gradually transformed from a constant threat into a neighbor with whom one could do business, and in time, into an object for future absorption. Alfred and his successors, his son Edward and daughter Ethelfled, the Lady of the Mercians, would slowly but surely reconquer these lands. By the middle of the 10th century, Alfred's grandson, Ethelstan, would become the first king to truly rule over all of England. Thus, the moment that might have seemed the peak of Viking power was, in fact, the starting point of their decline and of the rise of Wessex as the dominant force that would create the kingdom we know today as England. Having won a military victory and secured his kingdom, Alfred immediately turned to the second, and in his view, no less important part of his mission. He began his war on ignorance. The years of Viking raids had led to a catastrophic decline in culture and education. Monasteries, the centers of literacy, had been burned. Scholars were killed or had fled. Priceless books had been turned to ash. Alfred wrote with sorrow that by the time he came to the throne, there were almost no priests south of the Thames who could translate the simplest phrase from Latin into Anglo-Saxon. For him, this was not just cultural degradation, but a direct threat to the salvation of his subjects' souls. How could people follow the Word of God if they could not read or understand it? And so Alfred initiated an educational reform of unprecedented scale. At its core was an ambitious program of translation. He believed that fundamental knowledge should be accessible not only to a small circle of Latin experts, but to all free men of his kingdom. Under his personal direction, and with his direct participation, a court school was established to translate key texts of Latin civilization into Old English. They translated Pope Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, a practical guide for priests, Orosius's History Against the Pagans, Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, and most importantly, Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy, a profound philosophical treatise on the nature of evil, fate, and happiness. Alfred did not just translate, he adapted these texts, adding his own commentaries, reflections, and examples that his contemporaries could understand. It was a titanic intellectual labor. The king who led armies into battle would sit by candlelight at night, poring over manuscripts, turning complex Latin prose into clear and beautiful Anglo-Saxon. This activity was inseparable from his fight against the Vikings. He understood that to defeat barbarism, it was not enough to build fortresses of stone. It was necessary to build fortresses in the minds of men. By creating a literature in his native tongue, he was laying the foundation of an English national identity, giving his people a common cultural heritage that could not be destroyed by fire and sword. To realize his grand educational program, Alfred needed the best minds of his time. England had been devastated, so, like Charlemagne before him, he began to search for scholars beyond his own kingdom. He sent invitations across Europe, promising generous rewards and patronage to all who were willing to come and help him in the revival of learning. His court at Winchester gradually became a true intellectual hub, a magnet for educated men. From Mercia, he invited the scholar Plegmund, who became Archbishop of Canterbury. From Wales came Asser, a monk who would become the king's close friend and biographer, leaving us a priceless portrait of his personality and deeds. From continental Europe came the Frankish monk Grimbald, renowned for his learning, and John the Old Saxon. These men formed the core of Alfred's court school. With them, the king read, translated, and discussed the great works of the past. But his goals were broader than just creating an intellectual circle. He established a school to educate the sons of his nobility, both thegns and ealdormen. He insisted that the future rulers and administrators of his kingdom be literate. This revealed his profound statesmanship. He understood that to manage the complex system of burghs, to conduct judicial cases, and to understand the laws, educated men were needed. He sought to create a new elite, an elite that would serve the state not only with the sword, but with the pen. This policy likely met with resistance from the old warrior aristocracy, for whom hunting and fighting were more worthy pursuits than sitting with books. But Alfred was persistent, using his authority to promote the idea that wisdom was no less important than valor. By creating this intellectual elite, he was securing the future of his kingdom. He was laying the foundations for an effective and just government that would outlive him and become one of the pillars upon which the future English state would be built. In parallel with his military and educational reforms, Alfred undertook another titanic labor, the creation of a single, just code of laws for his kingdom. Before him, the Anglo-Saxon legal system was a tangled web of local customs and the decrees of previous kings, which often contradicted one another. Alfred sought to replace this chaos with an order based on the highest authority, divine law. His Dambach, or Book of Laws, began not with royal decrees, but with a translation into Anglo-Saxon of the 10 Commandments and other key passages from the Bible. With this, he immediately set the tone for the entire document. Earthly law must be a reflection of heavenly law. This was not just a declaration of piety, but a fundamental political principle. In his code, Alfred did not invent everything from scratch. Showing wisdom and respect for tradition, he collected and systematized the best and most just laws of his predecessors from Wessex, Mercia, and Kent. He acted not as a revolutionary tearing down the old, but as a wise restorer, selecting the best parts and creating a harmonious whole from them. Alfred's laws covered a wide range of life's aspects, from murder and theft to the breaking of oaths and trespassing. Special attention was paid to protecting the weak, widows, orphans, and foreigners. His code clearly expresses the idea that the king is not just a warlord, but the guarantor of justice and peace for all his subjects, regardless of their status. The creation of this law code was of enormous significance. First, it helped to strengthen royal authority and centralize the state. A single law for all undermined the power of the local nobility and reinforced the authority of the crown. Second, it helped to forge a national identity. People living under the same laws began to feel like a single nation. Third, it laid the foundations of English common law, a legal system that would have a profound influence on the entire world. In this work, the essence of Alfred was again revealed. The scholar on the throne used his intellect and learning to solve the practical problems of state building, creating a solid foundation for his kingdom's future. The experience of fighting the great heathen army taught Alfred a bitter lesson. England was vulnerable because it was defenseless from the sea. The Vikings could land anywhere, anytime, and by the time the Anglo-Saxons had gathered a land army, the raiders had already plundered the coast and sailed away with their loot. Alfred understood that the only way to effectively combat a naval threat was to meet it in its own element. He concluded that Wessex needed its own navy. This was another revolutionary idea. The Anglo-Saxons had ships, but they were used mainly for trade and fishing, not for war. Alfred decided to create a fleet capable not just of patrolling the coast, but of actively seeking out and destroying enemy ships. And here again, he proved himself to be an innovator, not a mere imitator. He did not simply copy the fast and agile Viking longships. He knew his sailors were less experienced than the Scandinavians, so he had to give them a technological advantage. According to the chronicles, Alfred personally participated in designing a new type of vessel. His ships were larger, higher, and faster than the standard longships. They had up to 60 oars, making them more powerful and stable on the water. Their high sides gave his warriors an advantage in boarding actions, allowing them to attack the Vikings from above. Creating a navy was a long and expensive undertaking. It required building shipyards, finding and training crews, and developing new naval tactics. The new fleet's first battles were not always successful. The Anglo-Saxons lacked experience, and sometimes their large but less maneuverable ships ran aground. But Alfred was persistent. He learned from his mistakes, improved the ship's design, and refined their tactics. By the end of his reign, the Wessex Navy had become a formidable force, capable of defending the coast and intercepting Viking fleets before they even reached the shore. This step completed his comprehensive system of defense. The reformed army protected the land, the network of burhs provided defense in depth, and the new navy became the forward frontier, the shield that protected England from the sea. For this, Alfred is often called the father of the English navy. He had proven once again that the mind of a scholar could solve the most complex, military technical challenges of his time. In the year 886, Alfred performed an act of immense strategic and symbolic importance. He recaptured and began to restore London from the Vikings. The ancient Roman city of Londinium, once a thriving commercial hub, had fallen into decay during the years of raids and was under Danish control. Alfred understood London's key significance. Situated on the River Thames, it was the gateway to the heart of England, an important trading node, and a strategic fortress controlling the border between Wessex and the Danelaw. Capturing the city was not just a military victory, it was a powerful statement. Alfred, as the Chronicle reports, did not just take London, but honorably restored it. He rebuilt and fortified the old Roman walls, laid out a new grid of streets, and actively encouraged people to settle in the city. London was incorporated into the overall system of burhs, becoming its largest and most powerful link. But the significance of this event went far beyond military strategy. By restoring London, Alfred demonstrated that he was not merely the king of Wessex, but the protector of all English people. The city, located in Mercian territory, was placed under the administration of his son-in-law, Ealdorman Ethelred, but supreme authority remained with Alfred. This move was met with enthusiasm by all Anglo-Saxons not under Danish rule. They saw in Alfred a leader capable not only of defending, but of reclaiming lost lands, of restoring order and civilization. It was after this event, as sources attest, that all the English people, who were not in captivity to the Danes, submitted to him. The restoration of London became the point of no return in the process of England's unification. It transformed Alfred from a regional ruler into a national leader, the king of all the English. The city that would be the heart of England for centuries to come was given a new life, thanks to the foresight of a scholar king who saw in it not just a military objective, but the future center of a reborn nation. In the late 880s, just when it seemed that Alfred's kingdom had found long-awaited peace and stability, a new, even more terrifying threat appeared on the horizon. From the continent, where the Frankish kings had finally managed to push back the Vikings, a huge army of Northmen, commanded by the legendary and cunning chieftain Halfdan, set its sights on England. This was not the same great army Alfred had fought in his youth. These were veterans, hardened by decades of war on the continent, well-organized and well-equipped. Their fleet numbered by various estimates between 250 and 350 ships, an armada capable of crushing any kingdom. This invasion became the ultimate test for the entire system Alfred had so painstakingly built over 2 decades. It was a test of the strength of his reformed army, his network of boors, his new navy, and most importantly, the unity of his people. Halfdan was an opponent worthy of Alfred. He was not just a warrior, but a master of strategy and deception, his tactics unpredictable and daring. He expected that by landing in England, he would incite the Danes of the Danelaw to rebel, and together they would finally crush Wessex. For Alfred, no longer young and worn down by his illness, this was the final and most difficult test. His entire life's work, all his reforms, all his labors, were now on the line. The world he had built was once again on the edge of a precipice, overshadowed by an invasion of unprecedented scale. It was the prelude to the last great storm of his reign, a storm that would either utterly destroy his legacy or prove his genius to the world. The new war, which began in 892, was starkly different from previous ones. Where before the Vikings had enjoyed complete freedom of movement and could plunder the country with impunity, they now faced an entirely new reality. Alfred's system began to work like a single, well-oiled machine. When Hastine's army landed in Kent and built their fortifications, they immediately found themselves trapped. Local garrisons from the burhs blocked them, preventing them from advancing inland, while Alfred gathered the main field army. Mobile units constantly harassed the Vikings, attacking their foragers and cutting off their supply routes. Hastine's attempts to break through this defensive network were met with stubborn resistance. The burhs, once just an idea, were now a stone reality against which the waves of the invasion broke. The reformed army also proved its effectiveness. Alfred could keep his troops in the field for as long as necessary, maintaining constant pressure on the enemy. His son, the now adult Edward, emerged as a talented commander, inflicting significant defeats on the Vikings. Alfred's fleet patrolled the coast and the English Channel, preventing reinforcements from arriving and blocking the river estuaries. The Danes of the Danelaw, on whose help Hastine had counted so much, though they broke the peace treaty, were unable to provide decisive support, as they themselves were threatened by Alfred's forces and his Mercian allies. The war became a complex chess match, stretching over several years and across the entire territory of southern England. Hasting dashed across the country, trying to find a weak spot in Alfred's defenses, but everywhere he ran into battle-ready garrisons and mobile armies. It was an inexorable advance towards a final outcome, in which the Scholar King's brilliant system slowly but surely ground down one of the most formidable Viking armies in history. In this final war, Alfred did not seek a single decisive battle like Edington. He was no longer the young and daring prince who charged into the fray like a wild boar. He was now a wise and experienced strategist who understood that victory could be achieved by other means. Instead of risking everything in one engagement, he chose a strategy of total attrition. His goal was not to crush Hastine's army in a single fight, but to make their presence in England unbearable. The network of burhs and the constant attacks by his mobile armies deprived the Vikings of food and the opportunity to plunder. The fleet blockaded their ships, preventing them from escaping with loot or receiving aid. Alfred had turned his entire kingdom into one giant trap. The culmination of this strategy came in the campaign of 895. The Vikings sailed their ships up the River Lea and built a fortified camp 20 miles north of London. Alfred did not storm their fortress. Instead, he applied engineering. He built 2 forts further down the river, completely blocking it. The Vikings were trapped. Their ships, their only means of retreat, were cut off. Realizing their hopeless situation, they were forced to abandon their longships and flee north overland, where they were constantly harried by the Anglo-Saxons. In the end, after nearly 3 years of fruitless attempts to conquer England, Hastine's exhausted and demoralized army dispersed. Some returned to the continent, others settled in the Danelaw. It was a pure victory of intellect. Alfred defeated the enemy not with the sword, but with the spade, not with fury, but with logistics. He proved that the best battle is the one that is avoided, by forcing the enemy to retreat without a fight. This unexpected resolution, achieved through strategic exhaustion, was the crowning achievement of his military career and the final proof of the superiority of his systematic approach over the traditional tactics of the Vikings. On the 26th of October, 899, Alfred the Great, king of the Anglo-Saxons, died at the age of 50 or 51. He did not die on the battlefield, struck down by an enemy axe, which would have been a common death for a warrior king of his era. He died in his bed, likely from another attack of the long-standing illness that had plagued him his entire life. His passing was quiet and peaceful, a stark contrast to the turbulent, battle-filled life he had led. There was a profound symbolism in this. The king who had spent most of his reign at war had managed to create a kingdom so strong and stable that he could die a natural death, passing power to his son, Edward the Elder. His journey was complete. He had inherited a kingdom on the brink of total annihilation, fragmented, demoralized, and drowning in blood. He left behind a state with a reformed army, protected by a network of fortresses and a navy, with a unified code of laws, and with a reviving culture and literature in its native language. He left the idea of England, which his descendants had only to bring to full fruition. His last will and testament recorded not only the distribution of his lands and wealth, but also the freeing of some of his slaves, once again highlighting his deep Christian worldview and concern for justice. Alfred's death was not a catastrophe for his kingdom, and this, perhaps, was his greatest achievement. He had built a system that was stronger than any one man. The mechanism he created continued to function even after its creator was gone. The scholar's path, which began with a childhood wish to read a book of poems and passed through the humiliation of the Athelney marshes, ended in the royal chambers of Winchester. But the echo of his deeds was just beginning its long journey through the centuries. Alfred is the only king in the long history of England to bear the epithet, the Great. This title was not given to him by his contemporaries, but much later, in the 16th century during the Reformation, when he was seen as a symbol of an independent English church and national sovereignty. But the title stuck and has remained with him forever, because it perfectly reflects the scale of his personality and his achievements. Why him? English history has had conquering kings who expanded their domains, wise lawmakers, and brave warriors. But none of them did as much for the formation of the nation as Alfred. His legacy is multifaceted. First, he is the savior of England. This is no exaggeration. Without him, Anglo-Saxon civilization would almost certainly have been completely absorbed by the Scandinavian world. He saved not just a kingdom, he saved the language, faith, and culture of an entire people. Second, he is the architect of England. Although his grandson, Ethelstan, formally united England, it was Alfred who laid every single foundation for this unification: the military power, the administrative system, the legal framework, and, most importantly, the ideology. He was the first to think not in terms of Wessex, but of the entire English nation, angel sin. Third, he is the father of English literature. His translation program effectively created Old English as a full-fledged literary language, beginning the great tradition that would later give the world Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Milton. Fourth, he is considered the founding father of the Royal Navy, which for centuries would be the main instrument of the British Empire's power. His influence can even be felt in the structure of English towns and villages, many of which grew from the sites of his burghs. For different eras, he has become a different symbol. For the Victorians, the embodiment of the pious Christian monarch and ideal family man. For the soldiers of World War II, a symbol of unbending resistance in the face of invasion. But whoever he was, his figure towers over English history as that of a true founding father, a man who, in the darkest hour, did not allow the candle of civilization to be extinguished. And so, we return to the central question posed at the very beginning of our story. How did the frail scholar defeat the invincible Vikings? The answer, having followed Alfred's entire journey, is complex and paradoxical. He won not in spite of being a scholar, but precisely because of it. His physical weakness, his chronic illness, which prevented him from being a typical berserker warrior, became his greatest strategic advantage. It forced him to rely not on the strength of his muscles, but on the power of his mind. He could not beat the Vikings at their own game, a game of fury and brute force. So he changed the rules of the game itself. Instead of a single, decisive battle, he offered a war of systems, a war of attrition. His learning, his love of books, which many warriors might have considered useless, gave him the tools to create this system. By reading Roman authors, he learned about strategy and fortification. By studying the Bible and the works of the Church Fathers, he drew ideological strength and an understanding of the importance of law and order. His intellect allowed him to see what others could not. That an army could be reorganized by dividing it into two. That a kingdom could be turned into a network of interconnected fortresses. That a navy could be a weapon, not just of defense, but of attack. He countered the chaos of the Vikings with order, their mobility with a strategy of defense in depth, their cruelty with the force of law and faith, and their lust for plunder with an economic blockade. The central paradox is resolved simply. The frail scholar never fought the invincible Vikings. The architect fought the storming party, and the architect won, because he had built a structure that could not be taken by storm. Alfred proved that, in the long run, organized intellect will always triumph over disorganized force. His victory is the triumph of reason over rage, of strategy over tactics, of civilization over barbarism. The story of Alfred the Great is not just a tale of a 9th-century king fighting bearded invaders. It is a timeless, universal epic of the human spirit, of the power of intellect, and of how one person, facing seemingly insurmountable odds, can not only survive, but change the world. His story teaches us that true strength is often hidden where we are accustomed to seeing weakness. A sickly youth, not destined for the throne, became the greatest of kings. A lover of books in an age of the sword and the axe proved to be the most effective military commander. His legacy is not only a united England, but also a powerful message for all future generations. It tells us that the strongest fortresses are built not of stone, but of knowledge, laws, and ideas. It proves that an enemy can be defeated not only by destroying them physically, but by assimilating them, by making them a part of your world through diplomacy and a common faith. Alfred was not just a warrior or a king. He was an architect of the future. He looked through the chaos of his time and saw the outlines of what was to come. While his contemporaries thought about the next battle, he thought about the next generation, about what his people would be like, what language they would speak, what God they would believe in, and what laws they would live by. And therein lies his greatness. His story leaves us with a profound and eternal question. What truly defines the course of history? The blind force of circumstance and brute strength, or the unbending will, guided by a clear and enlightened mind? The path of Alfred, from the marshes of Athelney to the title of the Great, provides an exhaustive and inspiring answer.